अस्सलाम वालेकुम ऑल ऑफ यू। आज हम बात करेंगे बेसिक एजुकेशन साइकोलॉजी में। और ये हमारा इस CHP कुरिकुलम इस CHP कोर्स का पहला लेक्चर है, पहला मॉड्यूल है। इसमें हम थ्योरीज ऑफ लर्निंग पर बात करेंगे कि डिफरेंट थ्योरीज कौन कौन से हैं। ह्यूमनिज्म क्या है, कंस्ट्रक्टिविज्म क्या है, बिहेवियरिज्म क्या है, कॉग्निटिविज्म क्या है। इन चार थ्योरीज पर हम डिस्कशन करेंगे। इसकी हिस्ट्री पर बात करेंगे एंड प्रोमिनेंट psychologists and other prominent figures who work on these theories. We will discuss them in detail as well. So the objectives of today's lectures that we will discuss the principle of adult learning and its implication. We will discuss that how we can define learning, at what learning is, what are the different aspects of learning. Then we will discuss the different learning theories, that how we learn. We will discuss these four theories of learning one by one. In the last, we will discuss how we can uh, implicate this learning in our classrooms. Yeah, simply what is the implication of this learning? So first of all, what is learning? अगर हम बात कर ले लर्निंग का तो हमारे जहन में ये आता है कि someone will teach us and we will learn from them. Someone will execute a phenomena और हम इसको observe करेंगे. And during that observation, we will learn that what he or she is doing, and we have learned this thing. So basically, this is also learning, but that is a passive learning. But that observation and that teaching, that is not only the single aspect of learning. Learning is a more complex process, and there are various aspects of learning. और अगर हम इफेक्टिव लर्निंग चाहते हैं तो फिर हम सारे इस एस्पेक्ट्स को देखना होगा कि जिसमें से सपोज हम चाहते हैं कि लर्निंग में अगर मिस्टेक होते हैं तो हम क्या करेंगे. So if there are mistakes in the learning, there should be a continuous uh, feedback that may be from the colleague, that may be from the teacher, that may be from the peer. तो ये फीडबैक जो है ये लर्निंग को और एनहेंस करेगा. इसमें मिस्टेक्स जो है इसको करेक्ट करने में ही हेल्प करेगा. Similarly, learning is all about the practice as well. Not only that is just to listen what he or she is saying, just to see or watch that what he or she is doing. Basically, learning जो है ये practice से ही आती है कि when we saw something, when we listen something, and जब तक हम उस पर प्रैक्टिस नहीं करते तो हमारी लर्निंग जो है ये नहीं आएगी. और इसीलिए हम नेक्स्ट मॉड्यूल्स में इस तरह डिस्कस करेंगे कि हमारी जो ब्लूम टेक्सोनॉमी है जिसमें हम लर्निंग ऑब्जेक्टिव्स ये डिस्कस करते हैं कि देयर आर थ्री डोमेन. पहला जो है ये कॉग्निटिव डोमेन है, सेकंड इज साइकोमोटर डोमेन, एंड द थर्ड इज द अफेक्टिव डोमेन. तो वहां पर भी हम कि कॉग्निटिव साइकोमोटर डोमेन ये दोनों पैरेलल जाते हैं व्हेन वी आर टीचिंग आवर स्टूडेंट. सिमिलरली जो है लर्निंग में जो स्टूडेंट होता है, जो फैसिलिटेटर होता है, इनके दरमियान जो एंगेजमेंट है ये बहुत ज़रूरी है कि if there is somehow deviation from that environment, so obviously there will be a negative impact on the learning, questioning and processing. So all these different aspects of learning. So how we can just combine these and what are the different approaches towards learning, ये हम इंशाल्लाह इस लेक्चर में डिस्कस करेंगे कि लर्निंग जो है किस तरह की जा सकती है, मुख्तलिफ अप्रोचेस कौन कौन से हैं, थ्योरीज क्या कहते हैं और उस थ्योरीज की हिस्ट्री क्या है और उसकी डिटेल्स भी हम इंशाल्लाह डिस्कस करेंगे. तो मुख्तलिफ डिफिनीशन जो है ये लिटरेचर से रिपोर्टेड हैं. So learning can be defined as it is a persisting change in human performance or the performance potential is brought about a result of the learner interaction with the environment. That environment may be a real life environment or there may be a control or the cool environment. Similarly, the learning can be also defined as the relatively permanent change in a person's knowledge or behavior due to experience. Now, if we look at these, they're relatively permanent. Again, this is very important that why we call is the relative permanent. We discussed in the previous slide that practice a man perfect. It means learning जो है ये practice से बेहतर और enhance हो जाती हैं. तो if there is no practice of that learning तो वहाँ पे जो है ये फिर वो जो change ये लेके आया है किसी की emotions में, किसी की वहाँ mental status में, उनकी जो executional approach है उसमें जो ये change लेके आया है ये it is not जो है absolute permanent, it is relative permanent because ये जो है वापस रिवर्स हो सकती है the learning if there is discontinuation of the practice of that learning. So that's why the Meyer et al. They have called this learning is a relatively permanent change rather than an absolute permanent change in the person's knowledge. That knowledge simply means the cognitive domain or behavior due to experience, which combinely the psychomotor and the affective domain. Another important definition by the Schuil et al. That was an enduring change in behavior. Now, that is again what enduring change means. Again, it is not absolute permanent, but it will be long lasting. That enduring means long lasting, so it will be not absolute permanent and everlasting, but rather than long everlasting, that will be long lasting, and behavior are in the capacity to behave in a given fashion, which is result from practice or from experience. So there are three different aspects. We can say that three different categories what we should discuss about the learning. That is the style of learning, the types of learning, and theories of learning. And we will discuss them in the separate modules in this curriculum. In this module or in this session today, we will talk about the theories of learning, which is the constructivism, the cognitivism, the behaviorism, and the connectivism, the humanism. All these theories will be discussed, and the remaining two aspects, that is the style of learning, which maybe we will divide the style of learning into different aspects and categories in the upcoming sessions. Similarly, we will also talk about the Bloom taxonomy. And Bloom taxonomy, they have three pillars. There are three pillars of the Bloom taxonomy. One is the cognitive domain, or we can say that three domains of Bloom taxonomy. So they are the cognitive domain, the psychomotor domain, and the affective domain. The psychomotor domain and the cognitive domain, I will cover them. I will discuss with all of you in the upcoming sessions. While the affective domain of the Bloom taxonomy will be discussed by the Dr. Abir in the upcoming session. Then the domains of the Bloom taxonomy, they have further divided into different level. We can say that the level of learning or that level of domain are somehow, we can also term them as the subdomain. Like here we have the knowledge, synthesis, comprehension, application, analysis. These are the subdomain or the different level of the cognitive domain. So this is just the cognitive domain. We will discuss the later on the psychomotor domain, which include the Simpson taxonomy. We call it another taxonomy, the Dave's taxonomy. So we will discuss to all of this what we mean by the cognitive domain, along with some examples from the medical field. And this blank taxonomy, they will help us in the constructing of the meaningful, specific, and measurable, achievable, and realistic objective or learning objectives. So चलते हैं and discuss करते हैं the theories of learning. Different theories पर बात करेंगे. उन theories में जिन जिन लोगों ने काम किया है, so we will discuss the work of each figure among them. So first of all, what are the principles of adult learning? The principle of adult learning, we will discuss them in aspects of the theories, and these theories we will discuss in today's session will be the behaviorism, the cognitivism, the constructivism, and the humanism. In the initial session, initial 1 hour, we will talk about the behaviorism and the cognitivism. And if there was a discussion, so at least we will try to cover the behaviorism in the initial 1 hour. Later on, at the end, we will also discuss various aspects of these theories, and we will compare the different properties and aspects with each other. So let's go and discuss the behaviorism. In the behaviorism, three main and prominent figures who work in this theory, they were the John Watson and the Pavlov and the Skinner. Among them, the John Watson or John B. Watson, he is considered as the pioneer, and not only pioneer, he is also considered as the father of that behaviorism. He is the founding figure of this behaviorism theory. So according to the John Watson, he has stated this famous statement that give me a dozen of healthy infants, build farm and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I will guarantee to make anyone at the random and train him to become any type of specialist. I might select doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even bigger man and thief, regardless of his talent, penchants, tendencies, abilities, occasion, and race of his ancestors. So basically, he was saying this statement, he was just elaborating this thing just on the principles of a theory called as the behaviorism. So now what behaviorism is? बिहेवियरिज्म बेसिकली जो है ये स्टेट करता है कि इंसान जो भी बनता है वो इसकी एक्सटर्नल एनवायरनमेंट से मीन जो ऑब्जर्व करता है उस ऑब्जर्वेशन से वो बनता है यानी ये कंप्लीटली इनसाइड जो मेंटल स्टेटस है जो कॉग्निटिवली हमारी एक टैलेंट है या जो हमारे जिम में ये इसको बिल्कुल रिजेक्ट करती है कहता है कि एक बंदा जो भी सीखता है जो भी लर्न करता है वो सिर्फ ऑब्जर्वेशन से करता है कि आप उसके सामने उसको जो भी ट्रेनिंग दे दे उसी ट्रेनिंग जो है वो उसको अडॉप्ट करेगा और उसको वही बनेगा सपोज माहौल आप किसी को इस तरह दे दे कि आप उसको ट्रेनिंग दे किसी चोर का तो वो चोर बनेगा आप उसका जहन जो है जो भी होगा बट आप उसकी जहन को जो है वो करेंगे सप्रेस करेंगे और यहाँ पे जो है द ऑब्जर्वेशन देयर विल बी डोमिनेंट तो बिहेवियरिज्म इज कंप्लीटली अपोजिट ऑफ द कॉग्निटिविज्म कॉग्निटिविज्म को हम बाद में डिस्कस करेंगे डिटेल से लेकिन कॉग्निटिविज्म सिर्फ ये कहता है कि आप जहाँ पे लर्निंग होती है तो वहाँ पे मेंटल चेंजेस या मेंटल क्रॉसिंग जो है ये इन्वॉल्व होती हैं जबकि बिहेवियरिज्म जो है ये कम्प्लीटली बिहेवियर पर अप्रोच करते हैं कि जो बिहेवियर होती है उसी बिहेवियर को ऑब्जर्व करके बंदा सीख जाता है सो अकॉर्डिंग टू हिम ही वाज सो कॉन्फिडेंट ऑन हिज थ्योरी कि वो यही फेमस स्टेटमेंट उसने दिया था ही अटर दिस स्टेटमेंट कि आप जो है मुझे बच्चे थे और फिर मैं आप जो चाहेंगे मैं उससे उसको बनाऊंगा वो डॉक्टर बस डॉक्टर अगर मैं उसको डॉक्टर बनाना चाहूँ तो डॉक्टर बना सकता हूँ चोर बना सकता हूँ उसको लायर बना सकता हूँ आर्टिस्ट बना सकता हूँ तो दैट्स बिकॉज वो उस तरह का माहौल उस तरह का बिहेवियर उसको दे दो तो उससे जो है वो बन जाएगा जॉन बी वाटसन जो था ही एक अमेरिकन फिजियोलॉजिस्ट था और इसका जो इस थ्योरी का बेस था एक बच्चा था जिसको एक फर्जी नाम जो अल्बर्ट दिया गया और इन द लिटरेचर उसको लिटिल अल्बर्ट के नाम से जाना जाता है तो उसने कुछ एक्सपेरिमेंट की थी उस बच्चे पर और उस एक्सपेरिमेंट को जो है लिटरेचर में अल्बर्ट लिटिल अल्बर्ट एक्सपेरिमेंट के नाम से जाना जाता है So we will discuss that little Albert experiment in the next slide as well. But this John B. Watson, he is well famous and the pioneer in the behaviorism theory, and all his work is based on the experiment done on the that little Albert experiment. And not he was only involved in this experiment. His colleague, the Rosselli, he was also involved in all this experiment, and this experiment was conducted in the 1920. So, if you talk about the behaviorism of the John B. Watson, or simply the Watson behaviorism. So Watson is known for his strong advocacy of the behaviorism, a perspective that shifted the focus of psychology away from the study of inner mental process and consciousness, which are difficult to observe, to study observed behavior. So looking at that concept, the key aspects of the John Watson behaviorism are the rejecting mentalism. We discussed them in the previously as well, that Watson rejected the prevailing approach in the psychology at the time known as the mentalism, which emphasized the study of mental states and processes, and instead he argued that psychology should focus on the objective observable behavior rather than what is going in the mind, rather than the mental process, rather than the mental talent of that simple person. The second aspect of the John Watson behaviorism was that stimulus response association. Watson behaviorism emphasized the importance of the stimulus response association. He believed that behavior could be explained by understanding how environmental stimuli elicit the specific responses. That is that famous experiment known as the Little Albert experiment, uh, one of the Watson world famous experiment, the Little Albert. This Little Albert, at the time of experiment, this why this is known as the Little Albert, because which is a pseudonym for that subject. The subject Albert was just 9 months old. 9 months old, he was at the start of the experiment. That's why that's known as the Little Albert experiment. And as we will discuss in the controversy and criticism, one of the major criticism on the John Watson behaviorism is that involvement of such little child in the experiment, and various aspects of that research, like the in modern life, we if we look at the research, so there was scientific misconduct, there was unethical concerns and that experiment, including there was no consent taken from the mother of that child, Albert. So in the literature, it is unknown that what is the original, what is the real name of that subject, but he is being termed as the Albert in the literature. So by pairing the presentation of the rat, which he used in the Little Albert experiment, he just paired it with allowed. Initially, when he started this experiment, during that, the Albert, that's an infant of 9 month old, he just he was just presented with some animals like the rat, like the rabbit and other animals, but he didn't show any fear. यानी उसके सामने चूहा लाया गया, डिफरेंट जो एनिमल्स लाए गए, और उनके इमोशंस में ऐसा कोई जो है फर्क नहीं आया। फिर उसके बाद जो है इस दोनों ने द रसीली रेनर एंड द जॉन बी वाटसन, उन्होंने क्या किया, इस बच्चे के पीछे जो है उन्होंने टू मेटालिक मेटल रॉड जो है, मेटालिक रॉड्स, इनको जोर से इस तरह मारा कि उससे एक बहुत एनोइंग वॉइस जो है क्रिएट हो गया। और इनिशियली जब उन्होंने एक्सपेरिमेंट, जैसे हमने डिस्कस किया कि उस वाइट रेड को देखने से उसमें कुछ मतलब ऐसा डर वगैरह जो है उसको महसूस नहीं हुआ था, लेकिन चूंकि वो वॉइस इतना एनोइंग था कि उससे वो बच्चा जो है अल्बर्ट जो है वो डर गया। और जिस टाइम पे उनको रेड सामने लाया लाया जाता था, तो उसी दौरान जो है उनको एक उनके पीछे जो मेटालिक रॉड को इस तरह स्ट्रक किया जाता था, तो उससे एक लाउड वॉइस जो है ये क्रिएट होता था। सेवरल टाइम उन्होंने क्या किया कि रेड ले आती थी और यहाँ पे वो स्ट्रक करती थी उस मेटालिक रॉड को। तो इसी दौरान जो है इस लिटिल अल्बर्ट जो बच्चे का एक एसोसिएशन बन गया बिटवीन दैट सीइंग द रेड एंड दैट एनोइंग नाइस। इनिशियली जैसे हमने कहा कि उनको सिंपल विदाउट नाइस जो है उनको रेड देखने से कोई डर नहीं लग रहा था, लेकिन चूंकि अब ये डर जो है बिल्कुल लग रहा था नाइस ऑफ दैट स्ट्राइकिंग अप टू मेटालिक रॉड, लेकिन जैसी जैसी इस सिचुएशन बन गई उस बिहेवियर जो उसके सामने था, तो अब विदाउट नाइस भी जब उनके सामने रेट लाया जाता था तो उसको डर जाता था। तो उन्होंने फिर ये कहा कि ये अब जो न्यूट्रल स्टिमुलस है, ये जो इनिशियल रेट उनके सामने लाया गया, सो ही इन द लिटरेचर इन द एक्सपेरिमेंट लिटिल अल्बर्ट experiment, this was termed as the neutral stimulus, and that was the striking of the metallic rod, that was termed as the unconditioned stimulus. But later on, when there was construction of that connection of that association between the hitting and striking of the metallic rod and the white thread, then this white thread become the conditioned stimulus rather than that neutral stimulus. And then when the unconditioned stimulus, which was no fear when seeing the red, then it become the conditioned stimulus when and the seeing of the watching of the red. Without that nice at the later stages, he was just executing some prayer. So that was a little Albert experiment, and different aspects there were specifically that how we can involve someone who is just infant in an experiment without taking some proper consent and some proper permission from their guardian, from their parent. The next aspect of the Jan Watson behaviorism is the environmental determinism. Watson believed that behavior is determined by the environmental factor and experiences. He stated that individual personalities and behaviors could be shaped through controlled environmental conditions. The next aspect of this John Watson behaviorism is the applied behaviorism. Watson behaviorist principles were applied in various domains, which include education, advertising, as well as in the marketing. And his ideas influenced advertising practices by emphasizing the use of uh, persuasive technique to influence consumer behavior. So it was one of the groundbreaking theory in the psychology, but there were also some number of controversies and criticism which were associated with the John Watson behaviorism. And the most important one that was, yeah, how we can just press and involve someone who is too little to understand what is going on in such experiment. So the Watson views were controversial when he faced criticism for reducing the human behavior to a mere stimulus response pattern and ignoring the rule of that cognitive process and emotions and behavior. So this is the second that was the second controversy and criticism, that he was completely rejecting the mentalism and solely he was just emphasizing on the behavior, that he was saying that in his statement was that learning is all about to watch and see some behavior, and through the behavior the person can approach um, to that peak level of learning. And but despite that controversy and limitation of his behaviorist approach, Watson's work played a significant role uh, in the development of the behaviorism as a psychological school of thought. Behaviorism had a lasting impact on psychology and influenced subsequent development in areas such as the behavior therapy or the behavior analysis. So, if you summarize all these aspects of the John Watson behaviorism, we can say that John B. Watson was a pioneering psychologist who championed behaviorism as a framework for understanding and studying the human behavior. His little Albert experiment and rejection of the mentalism were central to the development of that behaviorism, which had a profound influence on the psychology and the related field. So the behaviorism theory that is confined to observable and measurable behavior. Now, how we can say that this is only confined to the measurable behavior because of the projection of the mentalism in the, as we discussed, because mentalism is that which we can't observe, which we can't measure. But as this behaviorism theory that is rejecting the mentalism, so that's why it is only confined to the observable and measurable behavior. Next, to the that John B. Watson to another prominent Pavlov conditioning, which is also known as the Pavlovian conditioning or the classical conditioning. And another important psychologist who worked on the behaviorism theory was the B.F. Skinner, and he worked on the operant conditioning. So we will discuss each of them. The Pavlov, who was a Russian psychologist, and as well as we will discuss the Skinner who worked on the operant conditioning. So in the classical conditioning, which also known as the um, Pavlovian conditioning, according to him, the behaviorism is that when a stimulus is presented, so there will be a response. So a stimulus is required for a response, and without the stimulus, there will be no response. That is actually the simplest statement which made by the behaviorism or the pole of behaviorism. Uh, he also discussed that when there is a stimulus and that stimulus is unconditioned stimulus, so to the unconditioned stimulus there will be an unconditioned response. But when there is a conditioned stimulus, and that conditioned stimulus will obviously cause the conditional response. But when there is a situation between that two neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, then the conditioned stimulus can also cause the unconditioned stimulus. And he just proved this thing. He just elaborated this his concept and his aspects of this behaviorism through the famous dog and bill experiment, so which we will discuss in the next slides. So the famous Pavlov experiment, the Pavlov dog experiment of the behaviorism, if we talk about that, that has many aspects of this experiment. Initially, he observed that when the dog who was feeding by a lab assistant, so before the appearance of the lab assistant who was feeding the dog, there was the secretion of saliva was started prior to the appearance of that lab assistant, and simply the footstep of that lab assistant will lead to the secretion of that salivary secretion. So from that, he assumed that there may be a situation between the two conditioned and unconditioned stimulus, and then he just conducted and executed this famous experiment. So the Pavlovian or classical conditioning experiment, which in the literature often referred as the Pavlov dog experiment, was is conducted in 19th century, and as in the late 19th century and in the early 20th centuries. This Polo, whose complete name was the Ivan Petrovich Polo, he was a Russian physiologist as well as psychologist. And this groundbreaking experiment, which he demonstrated the concept of classical conditioning, was based on a empirical experiment in which we discussed that the experiment between the dog and the empirical the evidence from the dog and his lab assistant who was feeding to them. So he discussed different aspects in his experiment, including the neutral-stimulus, the condition process, the condition response, the unconditioned response, and the unconditional response. So we will discuss one of them, that what was the neutral stimulus and what was the unconditioned response in his experiment. So the neutral stimulus Pavlov introduced was the ringing of a bell or the sound of a metronome before presenting food to the dogs. Initially, the neutral stimulus did not elicit a slavery response from the dog. So that's why he termed as the neutral stimulus. So that bell ringing there did not cause any slavery secretion. The conditioning process over a series of trial, the Ivan Pavlov paired the neutral stimulus, which was the bell or that metronome, with the presentation of food. After multiple pairing, the dog began to associate the neutral stimulus with the arrival of the food. And there was a conditioned response. As a result of the repeated pairing, the dog started to salivate in response to the neutral stimulus, which was the bell in this experiment. Alone, even in the absence of food, the slavery response to the previously neutral stimulus became known as the condition response. The dog slavery response to the food, which occurred naturally without prior conditioning, was termed as the unconditioned response. Similarly, the food itself, which naturally elicited the slavery response, was referred as the unconditioned stimulus. So all these examples led to the experiment which called as the Pavlovian behaviorism or the Pavlovian conditioning. The second aspect or the second type of conditioning which was in the behaviorism theory was the operant conditioning, or also known as the Skinner conditioning. So what is this operant conditioning? First of all, so operant conditioning is a type of learning theory which we discussed that was developed by the B.F. Skinner, and B.F. Skinner was basically a psychologist from the America. And this operant conditioning, it focuses on how behavior is shaped and modified by consequences, particularly the reward and punishment. And the Skinner work in operant conditioning has had a profound influence on psychology and education. So here we will discuss a number of key aspects and concepts and principles which were associated with the operant conditioning in the Skinner's behaviorism. Skinner termed the behavior that are the focus of the operant conditioning as the operant, and these are the behaviors that an individual performs or execute voluntarily under their will and are not reflexive responses to stimuli. Similarly, the operant conditioning centers on the idea that behaviors are influenced by the consequences that follow them, and these consequences may be the reinforcement or there may be the punishment. And reinforcement is a consequence that increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the upcoming time in the future, and the positive reinforcement or the negative reinforcement may be there. So now what is the positive and negative reinforcement? The positive reinforcement involves presenting a reward or positive stimulus following a behavior, while negative reinforcement involves removing an aversive stimulus to the strengthen a behavior. Similarly, punishment is another consequence, and this is a type of consequence that decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring again, unlike the um, consequence as of the reinforcement. Again, we have the two types of punishment, the positive and the negative punishment. The positive punishment that involves presenting an aversive stimulus after a behavior, while the negative punishment that involves removing a positive stimulus to weaken a behavior. Skinner developed the operant chamber, which also known as the Skinner box, or in some literature it has been termed as the Skinner pigeon box. And he just developed this chamber to conduct experiment on operant conditioning. This Skinner box or the operant chamber is actually a control environment where animals, typically rat and pigeons, can be used in these experiments, learn to situate their behavior with consequences. And this box is actually made of transparent walls that may be in the modern world is also used, and these walls can be of glasses or some transparent plastic fiber where stimulus is presented to the animal, and then the behavior of the animals, which typically they are the white rat, can be used in the experiments. And then the researchers, the psychologists, they just observe and study the behavior of those rats to the stimulus which they have presented them in this box. So it is a small box which is providing a controlled environment for the studying of the behavior of the animals. Skinner identified different schedules of reinforcement that influence the strength and persistence of behaviors. These schedules include the continuous reinforcement. We can elaborate what continuous reinforcement is. Reinforcement, after every occurrence of the behavior, and various intermittent, which is also termed in the literature as the partial reinforcement. So these partial reinforcement schedules and the continuous reinforcement um, schedules were included. Similarly, another conception principle in the B.F. Skinner behaviorism was the behavior modification. Operant conditioning has practical applications in the behavior modification. Skinner work has been used in educational setting, the clinical psychology, and even animal training to shape desired behavior and reduce unwanted one. There were a number of critiques as well as some controversies was there in the behaviorism theory of the B.F. Skinner. Um, and one of them was just uh, that its focus on observable behavior at the expense of cognitive process and mental state, which is actually the basic of the behaviorism theory. Additionally, concerns have been raised about the ethical implication of using punishment in the behavior modification. But despite of all these criticism and controversies, the Skinner work in the operant condition remain influential in the psychology. And not only the psychology, it has been remained one of the influential theory in the educational as well. His ideas have been adopted and integrated into the contemporary theories of learning and behavior. So, if we summarize all these concepts and principles which were associated with the operant conditioning, so the B.F. Skinner operant conditioning theory emphasizes the role of consequences in shaping and modifying behavior. It has practical application in education and psychology and continues to be a topic of interest and research in the field of the behavioral psychology. So, if we summarize all these two concepts, which we call as the reflexes are the reinforcement, the reflexes that were the Pavlov conditioning or the classical conditioning, and the reinforcement, which was the operant conditioning, or the Skinner behaviorism or the Pavlov behaviorism. So, if we summarize all of them, the learning can be defined as, in that context of behaviorism theory, that this is the outward expression of the new behaviors, and that's why this theory was termed as the behaviorism, which only focuses on the observable behavior rather than what is going on in the mind, what is in there, and what is the strength and capacity of someone thinking. So there is no cognitive strength involved. There is no involvement of critical thinking. There is no creativity. This all because of just watching and the environment and the behavior and observation. Is all the basic of this behaviorism. So the behavioral psychologists, learners need grades, gold stars, and other incentives as motivation to learn and to accomplish school requirement. Students should be graded according to uniform standard of achievement, which the teacher sets for the class, and they should be equal and uniform to each and everyone. There should be no discrimination between the students on the basis of their different characteristic or properties. Curriculum should be organized along subject matter lines that are carefully sequenced. Now, the important point, how the behaviorism can be incorporated in the classroom. In the classroom, behaviorism has had a significant influence on the teaching and the learning strategies. And here we will discuss some important aspects of the behaviorism in the classroom. One of the important one we previously discussed from the Skinner behaviorism was the behavior modification, because the behavior emphasizes the importance of reinforcement and punishment and shaping and controlling of the student behavior. Teachers use these principles to reinforce desired behavior and discourage unwanted behavior. For example, offering praise or rewards for completing assignment on time or following classroom rules can reinforce the positive behavior, as well as it can enhance the environment for it can make an effective environment for the learning. Behaviorism encouraging the teacher to set clear and specific outcomes, and these outcomes and objectives, they should be not only specific, they should be measurable, they should be achievable, attainable, and they should be very realistic and relevant to the subject, relevant to the student, relevant to the capacity of these students. So in overall, these objective and outcome, they should be concise, but not so such concise that it may become meaningless. So they should be clear as well as meaningful. And teachers should define what they expect students to learn and demonstrate it, making it easier to measure and reinforce the desired behavior. Similarly, behaviorism can involve the rote learning, where students memorize facts, procedures, or rules through repetition. This approach is common in subjects like which involve different equations or some calculation, or in case if there is a sequence is required, the sequence of different steps in a medical process, as well as the various mechanism of some which is the steps, and all this is mandatory for in a proper sequence. So there then the rote learning or the learning through repetition is very effective in that sense. Similarly, the behaviorist teaching often include the drill and practice exercises to reinforce learning, and this can involve repetitive exercises or worksheet to help students master specific skill and content, which may involve some assignments, which may involve some homework, which may involve some logbook, during that practice and drill, their learning, they will be more effective and effective. Feedback has very important role, and specifically that immediate feedback in the class, that has a very positive impact on the learning. And behaviorism educates for providing the immediate and consistent feedback to students. Teachers use feedback to inform students about their performance and whether they are meeting the desired objectives or not. As we discussed in the previous slide about the um, types of reinforcement, that may be positive and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement involve rewarding desired behaviors, while negative reinforcement involves removing or avoiding the undesirable consequences. Teacher may use both forms of reinforcement to motivate students to engage in positive behaviors and discourage the negative ones. Behaviorist principles are often applied in the classroom management and for different management strategies. Teachers use techniques such as the behavior charts, token economies, and the timeout procedures to manage students' behavior effectively. Similarly, for students with specific behavior challenges or learning disabilities, behaviorism can inform targeted intervention. The applied behavior analysis, which is shortly known as the ABA, for example, is a behaviorist approach commonly used with students with autism spectrum disorders. So we will just skip this because we have already discussed on the critics and that controversies of the behaviorism, either if it is the Pavlov conditioning or the that classical conditioning or the operant conditioning, or if that is the Watson behaviorism. So we have discussed the controversies and the different criticism, and what was the criticism, what was the base of criticism. So we have discussed them in detail in the previous slides. So that was all about the learning theory behaviorism. In the next session, we will discuss about the cognitive learning theory, which simply we call as the cognitivism. Thank you so much to all of you.